Chat, how's everybody enjoying the patch?
I've already played 8 hours of it.
I know. how'd the raid and all that stuff go for the with the collab this morning?
It was awesome. It was awesome. Delightful. Absolutely delightful. So,
all right, let me grab the notes because we didn't get to talk about job adjustments because they weren't up yesterday. I figured that'd be a good kind of place to start. And then see here.
Yeah, the big takeaways are Paladin seems pretty freaking good. And got a lot of changes. Some tank stance now is basically almost just instant toggle on, toggle off. It's down to from a 3-second recast timer down to 2 seconds. And it has a different icon when you're toggling it off. So it's a little more visually aware of what you're doing. Just one more reminder.
Okay.
Couple of other little things. Every job seems to have kind of grabbed maybe one thing, couple of things. And then, yeah, it without access to content, like I'm not a talented enough player to read that and immediately understand what it does, but
well, this one's huge because the physical damage dealt to actually just all damage helps out Paladin a lot because you have your magic part of your rotation. So now the magic part can benefit from...
I've heard some speculation that Paladin might be the top DPS tank now.
Well, that's why you see
they were
this nerd, like all of a sudden you start looking at it because it's like, oh, 70-1. Interesting. Okay, so if they're still the top DPS tank, like that's probably why they had to go and make some of these already right out of the gate nerfs. I guess we'll have to wait and see how.
I mean, we'll see in Ultimate 2 weeks.
Yeah.
2 weeks. So
magical range DPS are the new limited jobs. I don't know if that made sense to you. I did. I mean, I thought, yeah.
Machinist got several increases, and that was a job that I think people had been struggling. And yeah, so Machinist got buffs, and just across the board, it just feels like an adjustment. Like as somebody that doesn't sit here and build the spreadsheets that funnel into the balance Discord, it's not immensely concerning left or right. Like ultimately I'm not executing at the top of my job anyway.
Warriors become more mage like.
Yeah, I mean, one of the problems with Warriors is obviously everybody thought that we were healing too much, and so it made a lot of sense to give
heal
us
more,
yet another heal, and also kick that up to 30 seconds.
30 seconds, cure potency 100. It's like 15 ticks. It's like 15 little
ticks or 3 seconds.
Yeah.
So
I'm assuming that they don't, have any factor of your other stats. Yeah, you see the grit stuff.
Yeah, Warrior felt great this morning, but it was me as a Warrior and then 2 Paladins, and the Paladins looked good. Everything seemed fine.
So it looks like Warrior Machinist seemed to be, and then everything seems to be timing being cut down. Like if it was at 45 seconds, it's now at 40 seconds. Fascinating.
Yeah, the 45 seconds down to 40 just makes things line up a little bit easier with the 120, and that's actually problematic.
Right, like, we've seen that.
So the fact that everything just continues to feel like you're always on this multiple of 40, 60, 120. Like it just feels like there's these moments where if you're slightly off, I don't know.
But this is
just as a number. Like it doesn't really matter what the ability does, just as a number. As somebody whose rotation does sometimes lose a global or break a combo, continuing to stack everybody so that all the perfect people are together and everybody else is just somewhere off alone.
Yeah, that seems
And I never add back up to that. Like there's no natural break point where I adjust. It's like, no, why don't you just do it right? Unless I'm going to have exactly 120 seconds of mistakes.
The only change that I wanted for Paladin, but it doesn't exist, is the Atonement change. I wanted that to become an upgrade ability on something else just because it only seems to fire. I wonder if that changes. I'll have to see if I have to revisit this controller guide as I wrap up Dragoon and Monk. And
so my heal potency on Shake It Off just lasts for 15 seconds. It's the increases damage absorption by 2% for each effect removed that lasts the full 30.
The cure potency thing doesn't last for 30 seconds?
No, it lasts for 15.
I was going to say 30 seconds of potency 100. That's huge because I don't even remember what the cooldown is on Shake It Off, but you could literally be like
90 seconds.
Yeah. Okay. So that's
fun.
That's awesome, dude. That's really cool. That's a big.
It's the same as Rampart.
Yeah. Now I saw some chatter, people like labeling this rework. I don't feel like, and I'm again just perusing it and no hands-on experience with it, but this doesn't feel like what I would define as a rework. What we've seen something along the lines of Summoner, what we've seen along the lines of where they've redone the Machinist, where they've redone these jobs. But this does feel like a set of real investment into the job itself. So
yeah, I don't know that every job requires a ground up like new abilities and like a whole new aesthetic for the job action trailer. Like I don't know that they need that. Some jobs, their class fantasy is kind of right on point, and the way they function is decent within the combat system. So for some of those jobs, it's just about the fact that like their output is not where it should be. And so, shifting things to being able to better manage the burst, or shifting things to have the right amount of mitigation or whatever, can just come from changing the way the abilities interact with each other. You don't have to delete all the abilities and come up with new ones. So like Summoner feels like they deleted the job and put a new one in.
Yeah.
I don't know that, like, I wouldn't want that to happen to Warrior because I'm really happy with Warrior. So I would say that if they ever get to the point where like Warrior is for some reason way below the other 3 tanks in DPS, then what I want is them to revisit where my damage comes from. And so either make my burst hit heavier or something like that, so that I catch up. Don't ruin that. And then the fact that they can bring old abilities out of hiding. I think we got an ability back on. I think we got Bulwark back.
Bulwark, yeah.
So we got a 90-second straight up 10-second block. Came back. I think a couple other things kind of came back for people as well. So, and then the fact that they're changing, like when these things, it'd be nice if they continue to evaluate how they play in synced content as well. So I don't really know Paladin well enough to know if this changes any of that, but that's something that in general, like you get some of these jobs that feel really, really good at 90. And in the moment you drop down below a various threshold, which might be as high as 89, but it might be like, oh, I really don't like ARR dungeons, or I really don't like Heavensward dungeons, or there's just these moments where like you don't feel like in your leveling roulette, you feel it.
Is this a new skill that just turns off your tank stance?
Kind of. So yeah, it before it was just tank stance and then you toggle tank stance on.
Yeah.
Now it just straight up changes it into a blue version of itself, and that just turns it off. So like it's not anything new.
Oh, it automatically swaps
just a toggle. So that
Still,
now you can pay attention to your buff, you can pay attention to your bar, and you can pay attention to your actual skills, and they're all reminding you of the same thing. That you are no longer in tank stance.
Rock and roll.
And the toggle is really fast back and forth. So it feels almost instant.
Well, and now that it's gone from 3 seconds to 2 seconds, that you're not like, oh no. The 3 seconds, even could still feel like a long time. Now I got a question for you. Patrick in chat says, I would like Paladin to eliminate tank stance and instead have a DPS and enmity rotation. Where do you fall on that, Chris? Because I know you and I have been just like, what is the point of it?
I didn't like when they simplified to what we are now with tank stance. So like I prefer there to be things I need to be doing to hold threat. The argument against that is that we have a shortage of tanks and there are people willing to try it, but they don't want to be yelled at when they drop threat. And so if they don't understand the enmity portion of their skills, even if it's just a flat enmity across all their skills, what it does right now is tank stance effectively just multiplies the damage they're doing, like the enmity from that, by 10. Mm-hmm. And so effectively what it is your rotation is your enmity rotation, and it's just a 10x. And that 10x means that if somebody comes in and is really good at playing their job and they way out gear you and they're crushing it in the absolute max gear allowed in content, and you're near the minimum in content and you have no idea what you're doing, you're probably still going to out threat them just because 10x is insane. And so I think it's meant to make the floor really, really low for tanks. But then all of a sudden you end up with a really weird design problem with how do you then make tanking complicated for savage raiders? How do you then, right? Because you're not punishing them for that mistake as directly. And so now you have to start having tank swaps and stuff be something where they're having to manage shirk and they're having to manage taunt and they're having to manage toggling on and off this stance. And I don't think it feels as rewarding personally, but people don't like doing less damage. Like if there used to be that tank stance was something that gave you extra enmity, extra defense, versus not having tank stance was more damage. And you get into dungeons and people are like, take your stance off. And then you'd have tanks that want to take their stance off and the healer would be saying, please turn your stance on. And it just became this point of contention. So, I mean, I see why they made the design choice they did. I would rather us go back to, I think I'm a better player when I get held accountable. I get really sloppy when they don't ever hold me accountable, when I never die, when nothing ever goes wrong.
Man, like I understand like all the reasons why, etc., but I still do agree with Patrick. I wish there was more like hate management as a part of the job, because right now the only time that actually impacts you whatsoever is when you have the savage ultimate, like where you have two tanks and maybe one tank is, you're right, like outperforming, not missing a beat, definitely putting it up. If both are in tank stance, the tank that's not doing that is going to be the one that's gonna struggle. But that's where essentially, if there was like tools and etc. to give that second player outside of the tank stance itself the ability to manage it. But that all being said, that wish that I wish they had for tanking in this game, like when you look at the queue times, when you look at the 4-man parties, when you look at all these other things, like it's not like a simple like, oh, just do it this way, because we've already seen the cost, we've already seen some of the problems and the frictions and the challenges that these they've faced with that, and we've seen how that makes tanking a little bit more inviting. And that's why, like, you know, we've memed on Warrior as a green tank, as a green DPS, because it's like you're doing so much healing, but tanking in and of itself has been simplified, and it only really is going to ask you to make sure you understand what little threat mitigation and hate there is, you know, in the hardest of the content. And that's the direction that the game is going. So I don't see them crawling that back in. I don't see, also outside of Patrick and maybe you and I's, you know, kind of wish to have a little bit more in the world of tanking, you don't see like a huge outcry from the community either. So it's not like everybody's like, man, they really messed up tanking. It's like, okay, tanking's a lot more, you know, it's maybe your aesthetic, visual aesthetic pleasing. Maybe you like the fast queue times. And if you want to get into the harder content, then it's going to sit here and say, make sure you have shirk, make sure you have provoke, and make sure you know when to toggle this on and off. And outside of that, it's not going to challenge you in terms of managing that hate. And Daru Boy dropping, I think that's 500 bits over on Twitch. Thank you. Also asking, who do you guys plan to main in Street Fighter 6? For me, I'm a Ken main. I'm always a Ken main. I might do I might jump into like Chung Li, and I'm a classic 8, you know, original 8, and then there's a handful of characters I like to step into, but I'm looking forward to 6 though. Anyway,
I'm a terrible player of fighters, and so I typically like to pick random, because then at least my opponent is just as surprised as I am, because I don't know what I'm doing.
Hey,
so
cool.
It's probably best if you don't know what's coming as well. So yeah, I mean, you can add the complexity back into tanking, and they do that with mitigation management, and rotations in this game are not wildly complex, but like Paladin, for example, feels substantially, I haven't played the new changes, but feels substantially more complex than Warrior. Warrior feels really straightforward. And Paladin always felt just like a little more intense. And so rotations on jobs can vary. And then where to put mitigation. When I look at tanks who tank at an ability that I can't do, the difference is like they are planning out the fight. All of their mitigation is being used very intentionally, as opposed to I'm seeing a cast bar and I'm like, oh, this thing's bad. And then I just, in my head, in that decision, assign a mitigation to it. But that may not be the same mitigation I put next pull. And so it's not as logical. So I'm really looking forward to the UI change telling me more about the different damage types so I can learn on like when certain mitigation and things like that are better used. And I can have like a direct feedback in the game that's telling me that. And I don't have to rely on going out to a third-party website or asking somebody who's running some third-party tool what I should be doing. The game should give me that information. So if they want to make tanking hard, I don't think that DPS ripping off of you is the only way to get there. I tanked my first Mythic Dungeon of Dragonflight yesterday, and I never had anybody rip off of me. And that dungeon was substantially more intense than anything I've done in 14 in a long time, because Criterion isn't so rewarding that I can't take my eyes and hands off of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I haven't been spending a lot of time in Savage. And so it was really nice to have an excuse to do dungeon content, which is something that like I hope Criterion as they continue to update it with 6.4 and 6.5, I think it'll be a really great system. And like for a first step out of the gate, they crushed it. But Dragonflight's my first Mythic, just really cautiously thinking about every pull, and when a pull started to go sideways, really managing it was very, very different. And I liked a lot of that. I liked that in WoW, like letting things, thinking about my positioning really matters. And Warrior moving from having like a cone AoE to a circle AoE felt like it took just a little bit of that away, that I used to have to think about how do I get everything in here. It was kind of a back of mind thing. It wasn't super hard, but like rotating around to be sure that you grab not just the things you're currently targeting, but there's that one guy just beyond. Oh, let me grab that too. And so shifting that overpower felt really nice. And now it's just, I just run into the middle and drop circles everywhere. So I think they can definitely add the complexity, and maybe Enmity's not how they want to do it. But I hope it's something they continue to challenge. And as somebody that isn't going to be going into Omega Ultimate, I don't know that me complaining that the game is not complex enough at its top level is something that I have the right or privilege to do. But I can say that down in the content that's achievable for me, things like dungeons, tanking has gotten very, very, very simple. And I would like to see a little more variety added to it.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Patrick, for that question. Because, yeah, we'll ultimately see. Like every expansion brings in an opportunity for them to kind of see what's working and what the players want. So we'll go from there. Now, on to our kind of main topic today. This is going to be solo versus multiplayer MMORPGs. Chris, you brought this up as kind of the topic for today. So I'm going to let you jump into it first, because I generally define MMO as multiplayer, but as we've looked at the history of these games and the genre itself, there's a lot of single player MMOs that have kind of done pretty well for themselves. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, making sure that people don't feel that they cannot progress online if there's not somebody else to play with is just a good design philosophy. Like, stop gating people's fun. I do think that resistance is part of it. There is like these high highs and low lows. The fact that, you've been struggling against a boss and you finally get the clear, that's really wonderful. But that doesn't mean that you should have to do like a jump puzzle to even try the boss. Because maybe that's like, if your goal was to kill the boss, just let people fight the boss. And so like WoW still does trash in raids and 14 doesn't. And I was, and like, I think there's maybe an argument for like, if the trash is not actively teaching you mechanics, if the trash is not actively adding to the experience, maybe there's a trash boss where like it is an act of fighting this gauntlet of things and it's many targets. But this, like, if people are there to fight encounters, let them fight encounters. Stop just putting things in between. And so when it comes to single player, I like that that's available. But I've been noticing that like people start to label certain MMOs as single player. And that's usually heavily geared on what you spend your time doing for your first 1 to 500 hours. And I know that's an enormous amount of time. Like a TV show might not even make it to 100 hours worth of content. Most don't. Movies, a whole movie franchise would never make it to anywhere close to 100 hours of content. Most single player games don't make it to 100 hours on a single playthrough. 100 hours is just, it's a hefty amount. But for MMOs, 100 to 500 is, you are still usually asking questions like, oh, how'd you do that thing with your UI? Wait, where does that item come from? Hey, I don't know how to unlock this content. Like, you're still asking questions that would be considered fairly basic, and you're asking them often. It's not like, hey, this seems weird that I don't know this. It's like, no, I don't know many things. So for me, like, this single player versus MMO perspective really doesn't affect the people that play for 5,000 hours, because you can say till you're blue in the face that Final Fantasy 14 is a RPG first, but first, literally, for the first 500 hours, if you want to play Final Fantasy 14 for 10,000 hours, you're going to be doing stuff with other people. Like, you just run out of things to not interact with. And so I don't know what a game should onboard you with. If the end game goal, right, if 4,000 hours is kind of the target and 400 is the new player experience, because that's what 14 calls a new player experience, the first 10% is heavily skewed single player. And in some ways that does a disservice, because they come shooting out the other end and they don't know what their abilities are, and they don't have any sort of awareness of gearing, and they don't have any practice interacting with other players outside of the forced dungeons, which have largely gone away, the handful of trials, and the alliance raids. And so they don't necessarily get this constant reinforcement, and the game doesn't push back and start to say, if you do not learn or master this skill, that's going to be a problem. And then all at once, a player says, hey, I want to do my first extreme. And the community's like, I can't believe you don't know any of this. Like, where were they supposed to learn it? And I got into a dungeon the other day on an alt with a friend in WoW, and our tank was wildly undergeared and like would just fall down to the very first tank buster. And then we would clear the boss while I just healed one of the melee DPS. And then we would get to the next boss and they would do a tank buster and it would just one shot the tank. And I was the healer, and I'm like, I don't know what I can do different here. Like, if you die in one hit. So, but then one of the best ways to gear your alt in WoW while leveling is to go run dungeons. So like, I couldn't fault them because they were where they were supposed to be. They didn't queue queue me for dungeons of this level. The levels are the dungeon. It was just like queuing for a roulette. They queued for a leveling roulette equivalent. So like, they're in the right place. So I think that's where this argument comes at for me, is like, how do we manage to let people play alone, but also be aware that like an MMORPG is always going to be a multiplayer experience at some point in your journey, unless you're just going to quit after the first few hundred hours.
Or you just come and play the story and then you quit and play the story to the expansion and then you quit. So you can play.
But that's only the first 100 hours.
Well, no, it's the entirety of the game itself. And once they add in the Stormblood dungeons, Final Fantasy as a game, you could play, and then you'll play 7.0 solo, 8.0 solo, if you choose to do so.
But how many hours is that?
It could be thousands of hours. It depends on how long it takes you. So if every expansion is roughly the equivalent of 40 hours, and we already did that one guy who was talking about how he hasn't even cleared ARR in 40. So you say like 60 hours and then you got 5 expansions, you're looking at a couple hundred hours, right? And then as the game continues to grow, like you can play the game and not interact with anybody. There's nothing wrong with that.
Maybe be duty support.
Yeah.
He would like to see if they can bring the trials. I don't think it's thousands. I think that you are done with Endwalker and you have less than 500 hours on your account. In most cases, unless you're just going back and like if you're just playing MSQ, I just don't see how total hours played, and that could take you years. You can come and go.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Like if you came in and you didn't, you beat ARR and then you took a break and you came back for Heaven's Word and you played Heaven's Word and then you took a break, like you could experience, like at the time, no, but now as the game evolves, I'm not saying that that's a bad thing. What I'm saying is I think the future of the MMO and the solo versus multiplayer, friction is going to be solved by AI, because when you make the open world, like in Final Fantasy 14, solo friendly, where like, you don't need people to go step out into the world. Like you fundamentally then there's a real sociological, psychological impact that it has on the community, because I don't need you to get from point A to point B. My thought is that when it comes down to the future of MMOs and their design with AI, like when you have the idea of the trust system and these kind of ideas baked in to the core of the game, that every experience it offers, it still says you can play this game solo, but the world will hit back So bring your trusts. And if you don't want to, if you want to challenge yourself, don't bring your trusts. Or you end up having that ability for friends to come in and fill in the gaps of your AI. And ultimately, then it becomes a really a you driving your experience. We talked about this where Final Fantasy XIV's greatest weakness in terms of its new player experience is the 2-player and 3-player number mindset. Because like if you want to go in and do that fight or do this, like you have a lot of dropping party and getting back together. And I think that the future and the hope of it is that you have a world that's dangerous, that you don't want to go alone. You can if you choose to. You could bring AI to come along and help you. So when the world is being balanced, it has the idea that these monsters expect that a lot of damage is going to be hitting them. So they're going to be a little bit beefier. Or you bring your friends that are actually in the real world. And so then you can go and have these adventures together. And thus it essentially asks the question, what do you want to play today? And how do you want to play it? As opposed to the game kind of saying, well, you kind of got to grind out the story, the MSQ by yourself, right? Like this is the big thing we talked about, I think, on Friday.
Wow, Dragonflight has that.
Yeah. And that's the choice that a lot of people made.
Now, right. You can do it with friends. I went back with a friend and it literally just lets me join in. I can see his quest progress when I mouse over things. I can take part in all the same fights. So there's nothing where like he's being pulled off into an instance independent of me. Guild Wars does this. When you go through story, people can just join you and you just hop right into your chapter. And if you want to break your immersion, you break your immersion, as opposed to like, I just finished Stormblood and there's a lot of solo instances in there. Mm-hmm. Stormblood was delightful. But I really enjoyed it, but there were a lot of solo instances in there. And so those were all times that even if somebody wanted to come back, they couldn't. They could not join me for those. And, you know, I just imagine that, like, my wife thinks it's ridiculous that I cry at this video game. And if we sat down to start characters together, she would be like, okay, the only way I'm doing this is if we do it together. And the idea that I would be like, okay, well, I'm going to go beat this, and then I'll probably go like make a sandwich while you struggle through it a few times because this isn't your thing. But you know, I put you in the best gear, so good luck. Yeah. And then I just like left her,
and you can't even like beat these watch, right? You know, you can't even like, I'm actively watching you play this fight. What did I do wrong? I have no idea.
I would have to physically go look over her shoulder.
Yeah.
I can't like be there cheering her on. I can't, and that feels really silly. You know, there's a lot of things about like ARR and Heavensward that in hindsight turned out to be very, very clever in how they've aged. But that one thing really has kind of separated that. So I just kind of wonder where the future of MMOs is as people start to argue that like they're going to single player or that certain games already are. When I hear people arguing that 14 already is a single player experience with an MMO laid over the top. I kind of wonder where the future of that is, because it feels like what it is we're in a time where people can jump games often. And so more and more people aren't getting over that 500 hour mark.
Right.
They're playing one game to 100, 200, 300 hours. And so I really will argue that you are not going to get everything done in an MMO without joining other players. You just aren't.
Right.
So you want to start taking on the Savage equivalents, the Extreme equivalents, the map equivalents, depending on the game. There's all this stuff that's fueled at multiplayer, PvP. But if you just say, oh, I'm just not going to do any of those, if you just take the 5,000 hours of content in a game and you just cut it down to 400 and you just delete what is effectively the vast majority of the game, then sure, you can play it single player. Yeah. But I think the majority of an MMO is still that way, but only for the people that stick around.
I think the goal of its single player component for any of the new design is to continue to invite players into the multiplayer aspect. And that's the other that thing I never see kind of addressed when this issue comes up is asynchronous multiplayer. The multiplayer that is actually happening behind the scenes that isn't necessarily like me versus you or you and I on this adventure. It's seeing adventurers out in the open world. It's seeing people out in the town. It's interacting them through some form of trade and economy. It's they're doing something in another part of the world and it actually has an impact, or some kind of event fires off in your part of the world because of something else. And that's the asynchronous side of it. Like we looked at like Death Stranding, right, for a little bit. There was this asynchronous multiplayer. And I think that when you look at what an MMO does and how it evolves from here, is that there is a clear strength and an advantage and a sense of removing anxiety from players when they're not sitting here having to step into a world and immediately have those icebreaker moments. Those things do end up having value when you connect with other players in the world. That's usually where you hear these stories, but it usually was based off of a system that forced you out of your comfort zone. But that's why I think the story and the world in and of itself is perfectly fine if you want to experience that in a single player solo kind of mindset. But I think that if the best designs will actually then bring about more of that asynchronous multiplayer, more invitations into the harder content, into the group content. So you don't have a game that's sitting here saying, because anybody who's coming in and saying, like, our game is going to be hardcore multiplayer. If you want to do anything solo, you're really going to struggle. Like, that appeals to a very small percentage of players who enjoy MMOs. And I think essentially AI is actually going to be the bridge. It's going to be the gap that allows for them to create dangerous worlds and dangerous encounters. And at the same time, appeal to people who want to play with their friends versus who are just here after work and they just want to experience the story and they just want to do their 300, 400, 500 hours, whatever amount of time in the game, and then go play something else.
Well, I just kind of wanted your opinion on it because my perspective of 14 has always been that it's an MMO that has heavily invested in its story element, but that it is an MMO, and you cannot clear dungeons and trials and alliance raids without other people. And yes, they've slowly removed the majority of the mandatory dungeons from that, and the goal is to remove all of them. But there's still trials, and Yoshi P said, I want to work on that. Okay, well, there's still alliance raids. And so, like, unless this plan is to make everything trust enabled, you can't even get to all the narrative beats without it. And so I've always kind of argued it's MMO first, but actually, as I've started to do things like capped homes every week, which is not something you and I were kind of always in the habit of doing.
Yeah, I never felt like it was necessary after Heaven's Word.
As I've started to try to do various achievement hunting, I have found myself being a lot more multiplayer than I'd been in years. And like a lot of the things that you and I regularly complain about in 14, that they don't use the open world enough and things like that. While I do think that the game's systems largely do align with a lot of what you and I were frustrated at, the community has found a way around them. And there are all sorts of crazy events. And being in an event this morning where I was literally assigned like a glamour color, and so we were dressed in different teams and stuff, actually was like the most fun I've had with glamour in a long time.
Yeah, that's great.
Because dressing up with other people, and like at the time I was like, yeah, they told me to pick a certain die, so I picked a die, no big deal. And then I show up through the Aetheryte, and there's all these little groups of 8 people, and it's 6 groups of 8, and they're all in matching glamours. And that was really special. And so I think the community side of it adds a lot of the things that you and I have historically complained about. There is kind of an irony there where, as various portions of the community have pushed us out over the years and then say, we don't know about this, but then like, I was invited to this, and like, we haven't been invited to a lot of the community events in the past. And so like, there is an irony there that like, they've claimed we're ignorant to community events, but you and I individually have been intentionally pushed away from certain portions of the community in the past based on statements we've made or thumbnails we put up or things like that. And that can all be self-inflicted, and that's fine. But it does mean that like that self-perpetuates. If we feel that there's nothing that resembles big community events in game that's available to anybody, and then we try to go partake in those things and we're told no, and then naturally we're going to go make another post about how these things are lacking from the game. And like, I can tell you, somebody choosing to include me in this, which is honestly just thanks to our community, because the creator that invited me and handled this said, hey, I don't really know much about you, but a bunch of people in my community recommended you. And so I was just reaching out. And so that's like, thanks to you guys. But like, it also means that like, without that, I don't know how the everyday person gets that. Like,
right. And
because I don't naturally walk into as extroverted and nonstop talking as I do when I'm in a big crowd of unknown people. If you guys take me to Fan Fest and put me in a room where I don't know anybody, or you take me to like, if I go to Brian's birthday party and it's all his college friends that I don't know, I'm a pretty quiet guy.
Yeah. Whenever I go anywhere that I've never been physically before, I usually am a very quiet person as well, as I just kind of listen and absorb information. But like to kind of what I think you were talking about, because I don't recall ever saying that there weren't community events. So that's news to me. But The
I don't know if I'm phrasing it well.
I was like, what you're talking
No,
about.
no, I
Like,
know there
is like
are. You and I have
whoosh.
praised the various things that
Yeah,
have
like
been
the
helmed.
discords that like my critique of it is always is that it requires a third party tool where the game does not offer the ability to do certain things, and they've tried.
I don't really
things
want to
like
get too in the weeds on kind of what I mean, but
okay, they've tried like certain things, but what I would love to see in this game though is that more trusts actually being enabled for open world content. And that's where it's like I feel like if you were able to bring the trusts into the open world itself, you could then structure the open world to do different things. The fact is that the world is balanced so that if you're going to run around as a black mage versus a warrior, like you should be able to get to your destination and to your endpoint, and that's good. Like you don't want to say, "Oh, I'm sorry that you picked black mage and that's what you wanted to play." It's going to be a hard road. You won't be able to get to certain, you don't want that. But if they brought in trust, then you could literally say the world is going to be balanced around the fact that you have the idea that people are with you. And then you could end up creating content around that. Will they end up doing it? It doesn't sound like it. I think that's going to end up being something that they would have to revisit in the future. And I think that's something that would be beneficial from the like the increases in AI technology that are already en route. In fact, like when we start talking about, you start thinking about starting an MMO now to build, where's the technology and stuff going to exist in 10 years? And like there's a lot of really cool stuff that like will mature and become something that could help differentiate the genre from like any other genre that's out there at the moment.
But I don't think it takes that level of overhaul. Like I don't like there is no MMO currently that of any of the big ones that is doing what you're describing that you want to see from, and you use 14 as an example, but like you're playing a lot of New World right now. I've been playing a lot of World of Warcraft lately. There's been a lot of Guild Wars, and like the world can be dangerous without needing NPCs. It can. Heart of Thorns in Guild Wars will absolutely smash your face in. And it does not stop you from getting access to the narrative beats. So you can absolutely put these things out there. World of Warcraft at various times in its history has had things that really felt like you wanted other players. And there's a handful of world quests right now where I still am like, I'd really rather find a group. And in addition to the weekly one that you definitely need to find a group. So they can do those things without NPCs.
Mm-hmm.
What you're describing is not something that I see any of the new MMOs that are coming up doing either.
Yeah, nobody's
and
doing
so like
that
my
right
question
now.
would be like, how does something feel more multiplayer versus more single player as a more like MMO as a whole, not just like Final Fantasy 14 in particular?
Yeah.
It's the strong example of like people argue that it's a single player game, as opposed to I don't see people arguing that World of Warcraft is a solo game first and foremost. And actually people sometimes complain about the number of elements that have either offered that or required that as a preferred path. It's pushed against that, and it's been heavily stereotyped as Mythic Plus and rating only, even though if you look at the percentage of the population that clears Mythic Plus and rating, obviously there's people playing it other ways.
Yeah, and well, in
like,
terms of percentages, it's like that is important content to have.
Sure.
And that's where I get frustrated at casuals that are like, why are they adding in like this ultimate? Like it's important for there's a community that's exciting. It creates this aspect of aspirational content. But a part of the challenge ends up being in finding the team that you want to actually work on that clear. Just going at it casually isn't going to get you a clear, and it's more or less going to end up having you frustrated. And that's where you kind of see this toxic elitism on the casual side like make its way out in the form of hard content when the game says, all right, I'm going to ask the world of you. We're going to see how like we're going to challenge you in every aspect that we can kind of design. And a lot of people find that fun, but that a lot of people ends up like in the vast like 27 million players for Final Fantasy 14. What is it? Like less than 1%? Like I'm sure someone's done the math in terms of like the population that does that kind of content versus everybody who's played Final Fantasy 14. And there's nothing like it's nothing wrong with it. You want with an MMO a wide range of options and opportunities for people to play with. Single player options are really one of them, right? But we can't not deny that convenience-based features like matchmaking don't have an intrinsic cost on how content is designed and delivered to the community. The question ends up being is it what people want? And I think it is. I think you like WoW in and of itself, when it first came out, one of the things it did so well was it made MMOs for the first real time approachable because they existed before. Heck, Final Fantasy 11 came out like a year before WoW or something along those lines, and it wasn't really approachable. And to this day, it still isn't, outside of like Horizon XI. Like, that is the most approachable version of Final Fantasy 11 that exists today. Even Chile started playing it, and it's like, because it just removes a lot of the barriers that are just naturally there. And so when you go into that aspect, the like making MMOs approachable is a good goal, because there's going to be more people willing to pay and play, so that essentially at some point, you know, the higher end content can be made. You can't have one without the other. There is kind of a symbiosis. There is some kind of sense that, you know, connectivity that all of the different styles of play have together. And that's, I think, one of the core defining features of the MMO is that sense that you have this asynchronous multiplayer that's kind of playing itself in the back end.
Vito's pulling up some WoW stats. I do wonder if those are for like max level players, because I know there's a lot of people that try WoW and don't make it to max level. So those numbers feel a little high. But even then, they're not that big of numbers. So they have a story mode difficulty for their rating. He says 63% clear at least one boss on that. 33% clear at least one on their normal difficulty. It drops to 19% for heroic and 7% for mythic. And that's across what appears to be the entire expansion. And so that's everybody who tries the one at the end, tries the one right.
Yeah.
14 skews its stats, because like for story completion and things like that, because it's so mandatory. And their normal raids are very, very approachable and are heavily story laden. So I think that people who like raids probably do all the normal raids and have gone back and done those. Some people who like story have done them as well. And then it's also where a lot of mounts and things like that. So there's so much tied to it that it would be hard to know like what percentage of people like that content for the act of raiding, or if they just like it for all the other things it brings. But then that, I'm sure that stat plummets when you get into Savage or Extreme. So I would assume it's a pretty substantial portion clear normal across an expansion, just because it's where all of this additional story is, especially the raid. The alliance raids, maybe the Yorha stuff had a different showing. Like maybe there's traditionally players that don't engage in alliance raids that did, and vice versa, because it was so out of place.
I wonder about that. Yeah.
You may have like drawn some people in who are like, well, I don't normally do alliance raids, but I really like Yorha.
Well, same thing with Evilise, because it was like, this in and of itself is so good. And what's interesting about Evilise is it leads into like Bozja and Bozja and Zadnor, so that it's like, I would venture to bet there was probably more people who have done the Evilise raids over Yorha, in that regards. But on a player by player basis, that'd be something that would be very interesting.
Really pumped about it.
Oh yeah, like the people were excited about it. I was saying that then also in terms of where we saw this in real time happen when the Crystal Tower became a requirement, how many people hadn't actually ever done it, and it was like, it was so easy to skip. Oh, and I was like, man, I remember when that dropped. I was thrilled. It was like it was my first thing to do, Crystal Tower, and it's still one of my with Crystal Tower.
They're my go-to. Alliance raids are my go-to. They make me feel the most like I'm part of an MMO. That day one 24-man chaos with 23 strangers is amazing.
Yeah,
today was my first time to do it with a full pre-main, and that was amazing too. That was incredible.
Yeah,
but like I've enjoyed it with 23 strangers.
Yeah.
So on this note, since we're talking about 14 a lot, not just MMOs,
I could bring up New World and how, because it's going to add some more single player elements as well.
So there was a mini patch note reading this morning for the patch notes, and there's been some translated stuff out of that from Yoshi P.
You want to share screen?
Sure.
And then, Ozzy was saying, like, if it's a main story required option, that it should have a single player thing. And it's like, I agree with that. That's one of the things that New World made a change, like, over last summer, where it's like, hey, instead of having this dungeon becoming a story requirement, there's a single player, quest line that you can take that takes you around it. Anyway, what did Yoshi P have to say?
So first of all, it is confirmed that 7.0 will take us to level 100. We're not stopping at 99.
Okay.
I think a lot of us are bummed at the poetic nature of 99 being referenced in a lot of old school RPGs, that we don't stop there. But when they talk about the game going on for 10 more years, then do you go from 99 to 110? Do you add, like, how do you round it back out?
Well, yeah,
Or do you start doing level squishes, or do you start doing a post progression system where 99 is the number that's always there, but then there's a mastery system or something that takes place after? And so unless you're going to change the way the game works at a pretty fundamental level, this makes it really easy, because then 8.0 is 110, 9.0 is 120, then you just keep counting up. So it solves a lot of problems. But a lot of us were excited.
Does it introduce the level squish, though? Do you think that Final Fantasy XIV follows WoW so closely that they go to 120 and then they go back to 60?
I don't know. I mean, WoW did it for a large number of reasons. It wasn't just that. Like, they'd been having some issues with gear score and stats and stuff as well. Gear score, we're in early Dragonflight and gear scores at 424 already. When you start to have gear scores of like 1,000, it looks a little silly. And so, like, 14 is going to have that same issue as we look at the alliance rate of today dropped 620, and that's not BIS. So, like, there starts to be something weird when you start to introduce a comma into gear score. So, like, the number next to your character is not, in my opinion, the first number that breaks things. It's like, is a 1024 piece of gear really that much better than a 1020? Because it doesn't feel like it is, even though a 4 item level bump it's a 4 item level bump over a very large number. And so it doesn't feel as significant, even if it's representative of the same percentage increase as it was when you went from 124 to 128. And on top of that, like, what do you do about the stats? And so we've already had a stat squish in 14. And a lot of that comes down to, it's really hard to read numbers on the screen when they start being millions.
Well, and just the data packages alone and all of that stuff. You're just like, wait a minute. Like, yeah, I agree with that. That's where it's like, the WoW introduced a problem, came up with a solution that kind of makes sense, right? When you start realizing, like, even I see people talking about prestige systems, like Call of Duty has got prestige. You're very familiar with that. Like, to a point where, do we get to a point where the levels themselves don't feel significant, in that regards, other than just taking you through the expansion? And the fact that WoW is actually going to 70, I felt was the most disappointing in all of that. I thought it was like, yeah, keep it at 60, and then you have significant level satisfaction, and then create. And
you just reset to 50 and you go to 60, and you reset to 50 and you go to 60. And that's just what we do. Every 2 years, you go from 50 to 60. Yeah, I don't know. How do you track experience when, like, the experience to get from level 100 to 110 is going to be preposterous? So how do you track numbers that big? Because we're already at that point where people are like, I can't believe this dungeon only gave me 1 million experience. And it's like, I mean, we're already tracking big, huge freaking numbers.
They did also reduce the experience overall as a part of this, the stat squish too.
They're gonna have to keep.
So that just means that's going to be something that you would think every couple of expansions, 3 or 4 at a minimum, that you would see that kind of happen. I think that if they do introduce a level squish where they do claw that back, it's not going to feel good. Like, if I understand it, that's one of the things that from the WoW perspective, I go, oh, it's way less intimidating to talk about level 60 as opposed to like level 130. But as a Final Fantasy 14 player who's got everything at 90, if you're going to say one day that's just going to be the equivalent of 40 and a cap of maybe 60, like, that's still gonna kind of like suck. Oh man.
And I mean, the problem is, if you do a level squish, like the level squish in WoW broke a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
Yes, it meant that some skills and stuff functioned weird. It meant that stats started functioning weird. But, like, it also started meaning, like, okay, so is Omega now level 20 content? And so then they had to come up with a whole new system to how to deal with legacy. And so now it is theoretically possible to get a quest item from Heavensward that is higher item level than a raid drop from Omega as the equivalent within WoW. And, like, it's weird. It's weird. All of the item levels broke. Everything broke. It broke a ton of stuff. They didn't do it because it was comfortable. They didn't do it because they thought it was cool. They didn't do it because it was easy. They did it because they literally got to the point that other things were breaking. So I don't think it's like, oh, is 14 going to follow WoW down their roadmap of this, like, oh, this is the brilliant solution? WoW didn't do it because it was a brilliant solution. WoW did it because the alternative was the game shutting down. And so I think if 14 gets to the point where something like experience is breaking things, or stats are breaking things, or DPS is breaking things, they've already shown us, then yes, they will, to keep the game alive, they will do whatever's necessary. But that's not because they're following WoW. That's because that is a literal necessary step to survival. If this game's going to be around 10 years from now, we're going to get some squishes. It's going to happen because things are just going to get too big otherwise.
Yeah.
Unless we want to start being people that are used to checking potencies with exponents, it's going to be hard.
Logarithmic. It's like, yeah, let's go.
So, and you can lean into it. You can do some really cool stuff. What happens when you start combining a best in slot, set for low level characters to go take on some low level raid, but they can pull from like every raid, because all of a sudden, in some ways, WoW introduced lateral gear progression for alts in a game that's never been lateral. Like now you can start to equip an item from Pandaria right next to an item from Warlords of Draenor at the same item level. So there's some weird stuff that happens when you're literally, in the way they lore justified it is you're jumping timelines. So like, I mean, it's all the same problems that time travel causes. You are literally breaking things because you're acquiring an item from the end of one expansion before going to another expansion that took place before it. It's weird. So I don't know. It's definitely, it's interesting to see that they are confirming it. So we are going to 100.
It's good to know that way. It's like, hey, it's out there.
Set it now so that when
that also doesn't have them commit to anything beyond 7.0 though. Them going to 100 it makes it easy for them to go to 110, but that doesn't mean that it's set in stone that they're going to go to 110. They could always come up with some other post progression system, because he could look at the WoW model and be like, yeah, we don't want to do that. We see that was necessary and we understand the reasons why. How do we prevent that from in here? And they didn't go to 99, but hey, level on 100, who knows? Like, so it does mean that I would say that if I was going to put money on in Vegas, that they will go to 110, but it doesn't mean that that's a guarantee. That would be just it's
the safe bet.
Yeah, it's the safe bet.
Because it's the easy solution. It doesn't break anything in the immediate future, and that allows the rest of the game to turn on. Yes,
as opposed to going
letting
to
a problem build up long term. But 99 would have created a real problem. Because WoW did do that. They went from 70 to 80, 80 to 85.
Yeah.
85 to 90, 90 to 100, 100 to 110, 110 to 120, 120 to 60.
Yeah.
60 to 70.
70. Yeah.
So like it's been a weird road. And like Guild Wars just stayed at 80. They've been at 80 for over a decade. What's New World going to do? We don't know. And like, there's people that look at the roadmap, they look at communication, and they speculate, but game's less than 2 years old. Like, do not commit those devs to anything that they feel now for a decade from now. Like, if they decide they want to go to 70, they'll go to 70.
Yeah.
They can do whatever they want. So, I don't know. Interesting. He also confirmed that cosplay for NPC equipment, such as Mog Station costumes, for example, that are gender locked, will remain gender locked. For example, something like Amaric's costume that is designed for Amaric will be tied to the gender of the character that it's for.
Okay.
If it's for the purpose of impersonating. So there will be no like female Amaric or female Thancred or male Y'shtola. That's locked. The umbrella from your fashion accessories will close automatically when you enter your house or the rain stops. They had kind of mentioned that in the live letter. In-game skin color, they plan to add more clear types in the future, such as clear. Like I assume they're talking about the theme, like for your UI.
Oh yeah.
I was picturing character skin.
I know, like also I'm translucent.
Translation's hard. So the UI themes, it seems like they want to add more. And he had mentioned that in the live letter as well. When they showed up the blue one, he goes, we'd love to make this for more colors. So it'd be neat to see those UI themes be like, here's the big themes. And within those themes, they each have multiple options. Like I want the translucent one, but I don't want it to be blue. Great, no problem. Pick your color. And it's possible the amount of markers that can save will increase again in the future if 30 is not enough.
Mhm.
30 should be enough for like 2 expansions worth, right? Because you've got 12 raids and at least a phase 2 marker set for 3 of them. So you've got like 15 there.
Mhm.
And then if you have markers for extremes and stuff like that, so it's at least 1 full expansion moving. So we can go all the way back to basically like 5.3 right now. But when you talk about people that do like mentor roulette or they run old ultimates or things like that, in my opinion, they should just, it would be better if they could tie it to the encounter. It would be better if they could.
Yeah.
And so that would just scale infinitely.
Like here are the
And so when
different
you
markers
go into
for
an
the
encounter, here's your 5 spots. And yeah, it means you got to set them up the first time, and maybe you have the ability to like copy paste them. Or
Well, it's the same thing that I
another
wanted.
scalable
Yeah.
solution would be for it to be shareable with like a hex code, like or something like that, where they've got where both now WoW, but Guild Wars has had these things where you can like share your character build, or WoW now has the ability to share your UI as long as it's not like add-on fueled. You can share your UI, so you can send them effectively a code that it looks like HTML code, kind of.
Yeah. That's one of the things I wanted for the macros themselves, is just to give us the ability in game to share them. It's like, hey, oh, cool, Brian, you have these macros, right click, copy, share, post them up on the markets, or like just have here's a general list of macros that you could just go pull down, especially for PlayStation players. It's one of the things it's like, oh, I feel bad for PlayStation players, because it's like, okay, yeah, you got to get a keyboard and mouse, pull up your internet browser, copy these down. Now you can go paste them, as opposed to like, let me just hand this to you. Like,
if markers could be imported, you could literally see, at the bottom of a YouTube guide, you could literally see a link to the markers.
Mm-hmm.
In a Discord that you're going to raid with, they could literally pin the markers to the top. They're right there. So, hey, the raid lead's going to step out this week. Somebody else is stepping up. Don't worry, markers are pinned. Like, it could just handle it.
Mm-hmm.
So it would really clean it up if they could do that. So good to know that they're aware of that. Regarding the expansion level cap, until now, the release level cap has gone up by 10 for each expansion. Therefore, patch 7.0, players will reach 100. Whether it'll stop there, or once we reach 100, or whether we'll replace it with something beyond numbers, has not been decided. And you can just picture Yoshi P going, players will reach 100 by 7.0, though what happens beyond 100 is undecided and feels half-hearted if the solution just goes to 110 and beyond.
It does feel half-hearted if it goes to 110.
It does. It's the simple solution, and it lets you put your effort into other parts of the game, instead of worrying about this. Because you can just imagine that if they are going to move from 100 to a new progression system, we are going to hear about it at a minimum of 20 to 30 minutes at all 3 FanFests going at 8.0. Mm-hmm. It's going to be a major point of mention during the media tour announcements and the related slideshow. It's going to be gone over in each live letter from when that announcement is revealed through there. We will probably spend 5 hours listening to this, just like the level squish, the stat squish. The stat squish, every single live letter was, guys, I'm so excited to sit down today. We have a lot of things to go over. First, I want to talk about the stat squish. And we just heard about it over and over and over, because he didn't want to live in a world where there were people who go, what? Like you just couldn't do it. You have to just continually remind people, because you don't know who missed the last 10 announcements. And is just now coming back to the game. And so, like, belts was another thing. We heard about belts over and over and over. Belts. Every live letter, belts. So now is the time to start thinking of a solution. That request ends up inflicting critical direct hit damage on Yoshi P. So note that place is considered exterior. Talking about, it was immediately decided that slots will increase up to 30 when he brought the question to the UI team to ask how much it could be increased. It's entirely possible to increase it further if there's a need for it, but now this should be sufficient. And today, I don't know if this is from yesterday. No, it's today. Today is Soken's birthday.
Hey, happy birthday.
Or if that was in Japanese time, maybe it's over. But I hope he had a good birthday. Time is weird. So, cool. Helpful stuff. Helpful stuff. Well,
any other highlights and stuff like that from all that? Because the level 100 is good information to know. Like at the end of the day, that's really good information to know. And I would say that if you guys have ideas and feedback, now's the time to make sure that those get posted on the forums, etc. You know, in that regard. So I would highly encourage that. And belts, yes, used to be visible in 1.0. Belts were visible on your character, and then that went away immediately in 2.0 as a part of the system overhaul. But they were still just a slot item. So them removing belts to add in more weapon slots and ring slots, I think it was the right call. Like it was.
It's
they
so
didn't have
weird
another
to me
choice.
that rings and earrings are visible. Why not trim those as well?
The trimming of the
like why have rings and earrings visible?
Well,
Don't get me wrong.
Those
dog earrings are hilarious.
Did
you
know?
Have to zoom so close to somebody's face to see it.
Earrings also used to be left ear and right ear, and so you could have two separate earrings. Now their earrings are as a set.
All right.
How sucky would it be if you did not want to get your ears pierced, but you're like, it's magical. adds a little bit of stats to me. Like in real life.
Why would Naoki Yoshida take over Final Fantasy XIV and approve them getting rid of visible belts, but decide that somebody should only have to wear 2 rings at a time?
Yeah, that's not fair.
I'm just saying, like, I've never seen him with just 2 rings on.
Yeah, I agree. Let's go. Let's get 10 rings.
They could just give us like 5 accessory slots and you can just mix and match.
Oh, that'd be cool.
Rings. And they're just general accessories. We'll put it where it applies.
Yeah. Like, yeah, cool. You want to wear 10
earrings can step up, or, you know, my wife got her cartilage pierced back when, I don't know, I feel like she did it for like her 30th or something. Like she's like, I feel like I'm like a middle adult now and I want to do something rebellious. And then it like got a little bit infected at first. And so it was like a whole ordeal. And like, and so she was like asking me, I had to like help clean it. And it was like it was terrible.
Yeah.
And like, it's just 2 middle-aged adults who want to be in bed by 9.
And you're just like, why are we doing this?
Like she's crying and I'm grossed out and I'm like, but we feel young, right? Like, yeah.
We're trying to hold on to that youth. Oh, let's get to bed by 9. Oh man, adulting is so funny. Adulting is so funny. Thank you, Farmer Girl, for that gifted sub. Appreciate that so much. Oh my gosh, yeah. Oh, dude, it's life gets weird, and it's fun, and it's crazy. Oh, anybody's hanging out on the 21st, January 21st in Fort Worth. I'm going to be at Hyenas Comedy Club. Going to be doing my my comedy show. So if you guys want to come out and see that, that's going to be, I think it's Saturday, the 21st. And it is adult themed. So just FYI for anybody with sensitive ears. So it's going to be a good show. Hopefully you guys want to check it out. That's Hyenas in Fort Worth. Chris, you got anything you want to plug before we wrap up today's show?
No, we've been publishing a lot to Gaming Kinda. So like, and if you didn't know that, I guess then yeah, I want to plug that. But otherwise,
I listened to your WoW like video that popped up my feed.
Yeah,
today.
Bellular kind of asked if like sales numbers were down and if that's bad for Dragonflight. And I think he and I largely agree that it's Dragonflight's in a good spot. But yeah, it sounds like he's going to get some more data and probably put up another post. And so I look forward to. I like the amount of data he brings to things. Some of the data he does, he's limited by what he can get access to. And so a lot of that's like how many people are clearing Mythic Plus. And like I have friends who traditionally play the game for Mythic Plus who are like who picked back up Dragonflight to play Mythic Plus. And I'm like, hey, are you still going to do Mythic Plus with us? And they're like, actually, I'm really enjoying Dragonflying and leveling alts. So like, I do wonder if that number is going to be skewed because there's all these people that have been yanked out of that content because they're doing things they haven't historically done. They're like, I don't know. I'm really liking the crafting changes. So,
all right, cool guys. Well, what you're doing more 6.3 today? Spoiler free.
Spoiler free. Well, I'll be doing MSQ in the morning.
All right, cool guys. Well, we're gonna wrap up the live show here on YouTube. Thanks for hanging out with us. Thanks for the great comments. I really appreciated the chat today. Really always love that. We'll be back Friday. We're gonna be talking about Josh Strife Hayes' video about what went wrong with gaming. So if you guys have not seen that video, give it a watch because we'll give our thoughts on it. Chris has got some thoughts. Have you watched it yet?
No.
Because okay, that's it.
Tomorrow, Thursday. Because we're going over it Friday. And then Chris has other Chris has a trivia thing for us at some point.
Yes,
so.
and he's put together something really good. And so, yeah, sorry, Chris, you actually messaged me in Discord. I completely forgot to reply, but let's do the quiz on Monday, because that way, like, I'm loving having the kind of the topics already kind of set and scheduled. So people are like, hey, when are you talking about this? It's like Monday or, Friday, etc. So if you want to watch Chris react to Josh's video, that's either going to be tomorrow or Thursday. So be sure to be following over on Twitch for that, and then we'll be discussing it here on the channel itself. So links are all in the description for Twitch. I'm gonna hit end broadcast and just kind of wave until it officially ends. So love you guys. Thanks for being